Dust hung in the air of Ring Station 12, catching the dull light that leaked through cracked ceiling panels. The station orbited nothing important, a hollow ring of metal parked between two dead systems, kept alive only because ships needed somewhere to dump what they no longer wanted. Today it was busier than usual. An auction was running, and traders from a dozen worlds had come to pick through the wreckage other people had given up on. David Osei stood near the back of the crowd, arms folded, watching the bidding screens flicker with numbers he could not afford. He was not here for anything special. He ran a small salvage business out of an aging cargo hauler, and most weeks that meant buying broken engines, cracked hull plates, anything he could patch and resell before his fuel account ran dry. He had come to Ring Station 12 because rumors said this batch of scrap was priced to move fast, and fast. Cheap deals were the only kind he could still afford. The auctioneer, a tired-looking man with a data pad strapped to his wrist, moved through the lots without much enthusiasm. Most of what he offered was exactly what it looked like: broken shuttle frames, gutted mining drones, crates of parts too old to matter. David bid on a few small lots and lost most of them to buyers with deeper pockets. By the time the auctioneer reached the final item of the day, David had almost given up. "Last lot," the auctioneer said, barely glancing at his notes. "One vessel, classification unknown, non-functional, sold as is. No power signature detected. Recovered from a debris field 11 years ago and never claimed." A dim image appeared on the screen. A long, scarred hull, half buried in shadow, its lines unlike anything David had seen from any shipyard he knew. It looked ancient, forgotten, more like a monument than a machine. Nobody in the crowd raised a hand. Ships with unknown classification were usually more trouble than they were worth, since nobody wanted to spend money finding out why they had been abandoned in the first place. David hesitated, then lifted 2 fingers. It was a joke bid, barely enough to cover the docking fee, let alone the ship itself. He expected someone to outbid him within seconds. Nobody did. The auctioneer blinked, checked his pad twice, and then shrugged. "Sold. To the man in the back." The crowd chuckled. David didn't. He had just spent almost nothing on a ship nobody wanted, and he already suspected he had made a mistake. Getting the vessel back to his hauler took most of the afternoon. It was larger than it had looked in the auction image, its hull pitted and blackened in places, streaked with the kind of damage that came from something far worse than simple age. Tow cables strained as his small ship dragged the dead cruiser through the station's cargo lanes. Workers along the way stopped to stare, some laughing, a few looking uneasy, as if the shape of the wreck bothered them in a way they couldn't explain. Once the ship was secured in a maintenance berth, David and his hired mechanic, a broad, quiet man named Tobias Grant, began the slow work of checking it over. Tobias ran diagnostic scanners along the hull, frowning at readings that made no sense on paper. There was no power source they could detect, yet the metal beneath the scanner was warm in places it shouldn't have been. "This thing isn't scrap," Tobias muttered, tapping the scanner screen. "I don't know what it is, but it isn't scrap." David rubbed the back of his neck, already regretting the 2 fingers he'd raised hours earlier. "Well, it's ours now, scrap or not." They worked late into the station's artificial night, popping open access panels, tracing dead cables, looking for anything worth salvaging even if the ship itself never flew again. It was well past midnight, station time, when the lights inside the cruiser flickered on their own. David froze, one hand still inside an open panel. Tobias took a step back, scanner raised like a weapon that wouldn't do him any good. The dim emergency lights along the corridor brightened, then steadied, casting a pale glow over dust that hadn't moved in years. A voice spoke, calm and even, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Systems restored to minimum operational threshold. Identify yourself." David's mouth went dry. "David Osei. I bought this ship a few hours ago." There was a pause, long enough that David began to wonder if the voice had gone silent again. Then it returned, quieter this time, almost thoughtful. "Ownership records updated. Designation, Warden. Dormant period logged at 231 years. For months, 6 days. Reactivation trigger, new ownership registration." Tobias lowered his scanner slowly. 231 years, he repeated. "David, what did you buy?" David didn't answer right away. He was staring at the ceiling, as if he could see the source of the voice if he only looked hard enough. "Warden," he said finally, "what were you doing out there? Why does no one know what you are?" Unable to answer with full certainty, Warden replied, "Records indicate deliberate concealment of origin. However, primary directive remains intact and unresolved." "What directive?" The lights along the corridor pulsed once, as if the ship itself were taking a breath. "Protect Earth," Warden said. "This order has not been rescinded. It has not been completed. It has simply been waiting." David looked at Tobias, and Tobias looked back at him, both men suddenly very aware that whatever they had just bought, it was not scrap at all. News about a wrecked ship waking up did not stay quiet for long, not on a station built almost entirely out of gossip and scrap metal. By the second day, half of Ring Station 12 knew that the strange, ancient hull in Bay 11 had turned its lights back on, and most of them had an opinion about what that meant. David Osei tried to ignore the whispers as he moved through the station's narrow corridors, but it was hard to miss the way people glanced at him now, some curious, some wary. He had gone from being a small-time salvager nobody noticed to the man who apparently owned a ship that shouldn't exist. Inside the cruiser, life had settled into something stranger than normal. Warden's voice had become a steady presence throughout the ship, answering questions when it could and admitting, more often than David expected, when it could not. Whole sections of its memory were damaged or missing, torn away by whatever had left the hull scarred and half dead in that debris field over 2 centuries ago. "You keep saying your first order is to protect Earth," David said, standing in what used to be the ship's command deck, now lit only by a handful of working panels. "But you don't remember who gave you that order, or why." "Correct," Warden said. "Command authorization records were among the first systems damaged. I retain the order itself. I do not retain full context surrounding its origin." "That's not exactly reassuring. I understand this may be unsettling. However, the order remains valid regardless of missing context. Earth has not withdrawn it. Earth was never informed it existed." That last part bothered David more than anything else. Somewhere, at some point, someone had built a warship, given it a single unbreakable mission, and then hidden the whole thing so well that even the planet it was meant to protect never knew to look for it. He didn't like unanswered questions, especially not ones this large. Tobias Grant spent most of his time buried in access panels, cataloging what still worked and what didn't. The ship's weapons systems were mostly offline, its shields damaged beyond anything he could repair with station tools, and its engines ran at a fraction of what Warden claimed they were once capable of. It was, in Tobias's blunt opinion, a warship pretending to be a wreck and not doing a very convincing job of either. Word of the reactivated cruiser eventually reached someone with the authority to actually do something about it. Captain Rita Alvarez arrived on the 3rd day, wearing the plain gray uniform of Earth's small defense fleet, her expression carefully unreadable as she stepped off the shuttle and onto the station's main dock. She found David in the maintenance bay, sitting on an overturned crate, watching Tobias argue quietly with a stubborn access panel. "You're the one who bought the ghost ship?" she said, not quite a question. "That's the rumor," David admitted. "I'm still deciding if I regret it." Rita's gaze moved past him, taking in the scarred hull looming above them. "I've read the report twice, and I still don't believe it. A ship with no registered origin wakes up after 200 years and tells you its job is to protect Earth. You understand how that sounds." "Believe me, I understand exactly how it sounds." She asked to see the ship, and David let her, mostly because he suspected refusing would only make things worse. Warden answered her questions the same way it answered David's, honestly and without exaggeration, admitting the limits of its own memory without hesitation. Rita listened, arms crossed, her skepticism slowly giving way to something more careful, more thoughtful. "If this is real," she said finally, "if there really is a ship out here whose entire purpose is defending Earth, then Earth needs to know about it. Officially, not through station gossip." "And if it's not real?" David asked. "If it's some old automated system running a script nobody bothered to delete?" Rita didn't answer immediately. She looked at the corridor around them, at the dust that Warden's systems hadn't yet cleared, at the quiet hum of power running through a ship that had been silent longer than either of them had been alive. "Then we've wasted a few days," she said. "But if it is real, and we ignore it, that's a mistake we might not get to fix later." Not everyone shared her caution. By the end of the week, other visitors had started arriving at Ring Station 12, some claiming to be interested buyers, others less honest about their intentions. A pair of scavengers tried to sneak aboard the cruiser overnight, only to be stopped cold by Warden sealing every door before they got past the outer hull. A station official, polite but insistent, suggested more than once that the ship might be safer in official galactic custody, somewhere far from David's ownership. David refused every offer, every polite suggestion, every attempt to quietly take the ship away from him. He didn't fully understand why yet, but something about Warden's steady, patient voice made him feel responsible for it, the same way he'd feel responsible for a stray animal that had wandered onto his ship expecting to be fed. By the time Rita left to file her official report, one thing had become clear to both of them. Whatever Warden truly was, and whatever had happened to it 200 years ago, its story was not finished yet. And judging by the attention it was already drawing, neither was theirs. 12 light years from Ring Station 12, a fleet moved through empty space with the quiet confidence of something that had never lost. The ships were sleek and dark, arranged in tight formation, cutting through the void toward a system most of their crews had never heard of before this mission. At the head of the fleet, aboard the flagship, Grand Marshal Dresk studied the tactical display with the mild interest of a man reviewing paperwork rather than planning a conquest. "Confirm the target system," Dresk said, without looking up. An officer at a nearby console straightened. "Sol system, Grand Marshal. Third planet, designated Earth by its inhabitants. Population significant, technology minimal by Dominion standards. No standing alliance with any recognized power. No formal defense treaty on record." Dresk allowed himself a thin smile. In his long career annexing minor systems for the Vanter Dominion, he had learned to recognize an easy target within seconds. Earth checked every box. Isolated, underdeveloped, unprotected. The kind of world that could be claimed quietly, its resources absorbed, its people reorganized under Dominion authority, all without drawing unwanted attention from larger powers who might otherwise object. "Advance at standard approach speed," he ordered. "There is no reason to hurry toward a fight that will not happen." Back at Ring Station 12, David Osei had no idea that a fleet was already moving in his direction. His days had settled into something almost normal, if repairing a 200-year-old warship with a mysterious past could ever be called normal. Tobias Grant continued working through the cruiser's damaged systems one panel at a time, muttering about parts he couldn't find and power routing that made no logical sense. Warden, meanwhile, had slowly begun recovering fragments of memory it hadn't been able to access before, though most of what it found only raised more questions than it answered. It was Captain Rita Alvarez who brought the warning, arriving without notice, her expression tighter than David had seen it before. "We picked up a fleet 3 days ago," she said, stepping into the cruiser's command deck without waiting for an invitation. "Long-range sensors, nothing close enough to be sure at first. Now we're sure." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sure of what? A Vanter Dominion fleet, heading toward Sol, toward Earth. The name meant little to David beyond vague reports he'd heard traders mention over the years, stories of systems annexed quietly, populations absorbed with little resistance because resistance had never been possible. He had never expected any of it to reach as far as his own home system. "How bad is it?" he asked. Rita didn't sugarcoat the answer. "Earth's defense fleet has 12 ships capable of real combat. Outdated designs, most of them older than I am. The Dominion fleet heading our way has over 40, and their technology is a full generation ahead of ours, maybe more. If they reach Earth before we're ready, there won't be much of a fight. There will just be a surrender or a slaughter, depending on how stubborn we decide to be." Warden's voice broke into the conversation, steady as always. "I have recovered partial records referencing prior Dominion annexation campaigns. Pattern consistent with current approach. Isolated system, minimal defense capability, low probability of external intervention. This matches known Dominion strategy for low-risk expansion." David looked toward the ceiling, as if Warden's presence had a physical location worth addressing directly. "You said your first order was to protect Earth. Is this what it meant? A fleet like this?" "Unknown with certainty," Warden admitted. "However, current threat level is consistent with scenarios requiring direct intervention. Recommend immediate preparation." Rita's eyes moved between David and the dim lights lining the command deck, clearly still adjusting to the idea of taking orders, even indirectly, from a machine that had been asleep longer than most human institutions had existed. Preparation with what? A single damaged cruiser and Earth's outdated fleet. That's not exactly a winning combination. No, Warden agreed. It is not. However, it is what is available. Delay reduces available preparation time. Recommend beginning immediately. David stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him in a way that felt different from anything he'd experienced running his small salvage business. A week ago, his biggest concern had been finding enough scrap to cover his fuel costs. Now he was standing inside a warship built to protect a planet that had no idea how close it was to losing everything. "All right," he said finally, more to himself than to anyone else. "Then we start now." Rita nodded, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly now that a decision had been made, even if the odds hadn't improved. "I'll get word to Earth's Fleet Command. We're going to need every ship we can get, every crew willing to fly them, and probably a fair amount of luck on top of that. And repairs," Tobias added from the doorway, arms crossed, looking more tired than either of them. "Lots and lots of repairs." Warden's lights pulsed gently along the corridor, as close to agreement as the ship seemed capable of expressing. Estimated time until Dominion fleet arrival, 19 days, based on current approach speed. Recommend efficient use of available time. 19 days. David repeated the number in his head, trying to make it feel like enough. It didn't. But 19 days was what they had, and standing around wishing for more of it wouldn't repair a single damaged system or convince a single frightened crew member to fly into a fight against ships twice their size. Outside, far beyond the reach of any sensor still working on David's small salvaged cruiser, the Dominion fleet continued its slow, confident advance, entirely unaware that the world it planned to claim without resistance had just found a reason to fight back. Not every war begins with an attack. Sometimes it begins with an argument over spare parts nobody wants to sell, and that was exactly how David Osei spent his first morning of the 19 days he had left. The parts dealer across the station refused to lower his price on a set of shield capacitors, insisting that rumors of an approaching fleet made everything more valuable, not less. David argued for 20 minutes before giving up and paying full price anyway, reminding himself that arguing over money meant less now than it ever had before. Back aboard the cruiser, Tobias Grant had already started organizing repairs into something resembling a plan, though he complained the entire time that 19 days wasn't nearly enough to fix a ship that had been rotting quietly for 2 centuries. Warden helped where it could, guiding Tobias towards systems that might still respond to power, systems that had been sealed away so thoroughly that even scans from the auction hadn't detected them. One of those systems turned out to be a secondary weapons array, buried deep beneath layers of hull plating that Tobias had assumed were simply structural. "This wasn't in any of the earlier scans," Tobias said, staring at the newly exposed housing with a mixture of excitement and suspicion. "Correct," Warden replied. "Certain systems were deliberately shielded from external scanning. This was likely intended to prevent unauthorized parties from assessing full combat capability." David crouched beside the opened panel, running a hand along cool metal that hadn't seen light in longer than anyone could easily imagine. "Can we get it working in time?" "Uncertain. Power routing to this system was among the most severely damaged. Repair will require both time and materials beyond current inventory." It became the pattern of the following days. Uncover a hidden system, discover it damaged beyond easy repair, scramble to find the parts in time to fix it anyway. David spent long hours trading, bargaining, and occasionally outright begging suppliers across the station for anything that might help, while Tobias worked himself past exhaustion trying to piece together technology decades ahead of anything he'd trained on. Captain Rita Alvarez, meanwhile, faced a different kind of battle back on Earth. She brought the warning to Fleet Command, laying out sensor data, projected timelines, and the grim math of 12 outdated ships against a Dominion fleet more than 3 times their size. Some officers listened carefully. Others dismissed the threat entirely, unwilling to believe an unknown alien fleet was truly bound for their system until it arrived close enough to see with unaided eyes. She fared no better with the Galactic Trade Council. Elder Sova, a cautious representative known for avoiding conflict at almost any cost, listened politely to Rita's report before offering nothing more than sympathetic words. The Council cannot involve itself in matters between the Dominion and an unaligned world, Sova said, her tone gentle but final. Intervention risks provoking a larger conflict than the one you are trying to prevent. An entire planet may be annexed, Rita said, struggling to keep frustration out of her voice. Millions of people, and you're telling me the Council would rather do nothing than risk upsetting the Dominion? I understand your anger, Sova replied. But the Council's neutrality has protected far more worlds than it has failed. I am sorry. Earth will have to defend itself. Rita left the meeting with nothing but confirmation that Earth was, in every practical sense, alone. She returned to Fleet Command determined to make the most of what little they had, working alongside officers willing to listen, coordinating repair schedules, supply routes, and crew assignments with a focus that left little room for despair, even as the numbers remained stubbornly grim. Back aboard the cruiser, David found himself recruiting in ways he never expected. Word had spread that the ship needed hands willing to work without much pay and even less certainty of survival. A handful of station workers volunteered anyway, some out of curiosity, some because they had nowhere better to be, and a few, David suspected, simply because the idea of doing nothing while a fleet approached felt worse than doing something dangerous instead. Warden's role in the growing crew became something David hadn't quite expected either. The ship's AI answered questions patiently, explained systems clearly, and slowly earned a kind of quiet trust from people who had every reason to be nervous around a machine that had spent 2 centuries as an unexplained mystery. You've been very calm about all this, David said one evening, alone in the command deck, watching status lights flicker across newly repaired panels. Calm is efficient, Warden replied. Panic reduces functional capability. My original purpose was to protect Earth. Current circumstances align closely with that purpose. There is little reason for uncertainty regarding my role, even if the outcome remains uncertain. I wish I felt that certain, David admitted. You do not need certainty, Warden said. You require preparation. Uncertainty and preparation are not opposites. David let that sit for a moment, finding more comfort in it than he expected. Outside the hull, station traffic continued as always, oblivious to the countdown running quietly aboard the ship docked in Bay 11. 19 days had already become 12, then 9, each one shorter than the last, each one filled with repairs, arguments, small victories, and the constant, unspoken awareness that time was the one resource none of them could trade for more. By the time the ship's secondary weapons array finally hummed to life, tested carefully in a controlled burst that rattled the entire dock, David allowed himself a small, tired smile. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough, not against a fleet the size of what was coming. But it was something, and after days of setbacks, something felt like more than they'd had before. Earth's sky had never held so many warships at once, and most of the people looking up from cities and coastlines had no idea what any of them meant. To them, the lights moving silently above the clouds were distant and unreal, more rumor than danger. Even as the Vanter Dominion fleet dropped out of transit at the edge of the Sol system and began its final approach. Grand Marshal Dresk watched the tactical display aboard his flagship with the same detached confidence he had carried across dozens of previous campaigns. Earth's defense fleet had gathered to meet him, 12 outdated ships arranged in a formation that looked more desperate than strategic. Beside them floated something new, something his scans couldn't fully classify, an aging cruiser of unknown origin that had somehow slipped past every prior assessment of this system's capabilities. Unregistered vessel confirmed among enemy formation, an officer reported. Classification uncertain. Power signature inconsistent with local technology. Dresk studied the readout for only a moment before dismissing it. One additional relic does not change the outcome. Proceed with standard engagement pattern. Aboard the cruiser, David Osei stood in the command deck beside Captain Rita Alvarez, watching the same tactical display from the other side. Warden's systems, still imperfect but far stronger than the wreck David had bought weeks earlier, processed the approaching fleet with quiet precision. 43 vessels confirmed, Warden reported. Formation consistent with standard Dominion engagement doctrine. Recommend adjusting Earth fleet positioning to exploit predictable pattern. Rita relayed the recommendation to Fleet Command, her voice steady despite the tension visible in every line of her posture. Around the system, Earth's 12 ships shifted formation, spreading wider than expected, breaking the neat, defensive cluster the Dominion fleet had anticipated. The battle began the way most battles began, with distance closing and weapons opening fire long before anyone could see the ships they were shooting at with anything but sensors and screens. Energy weapons lit the darkness in brief, silent flashes. Earth's outdated ships took hits almost immediately, shields flickering under fire from Dominion weapons a full generation more advanced than anything humanity had built. David gripped the edge of a console, watching numbers shift on the display, numbers that represented real ships, real crews, real people whose names he would never know, but whose lives depended entirely on whether 19 days of frantic repair work had been enough. "They're pushing hard on the left flank," Rita said, voice tight. "If that line breaks, they'll be through to the inner system in minutes." "Adjusting course," Warden said. "Recommend the cruiser intercept directly." David didn't hesitate. "Do it." The ship surged forward, engines straining under power levels they hadn't run at in over 2 centuries. Warning lights flickered across half the panels as newly repaired systems worked harder than Tobias Grant had ever tested them. The cruiser cut across the battle line, drawing fire from 3 Dominion ships that had expected an easy path through Earth's weakened flank instead. Grand Marshal Dresk's confidence cracked for the first time when his tactical officer reported the unregistered cruiser's weapons output. "Impossible," Dresk muttered, staring at numbers that shouldn't have belonged to any ship this old. "That vessel should not have that capability. It does not match any known Dominion or Allied technology," the officer confirmed. "Origin remains unclear." Warden's secondary weapons array, the one buried beneath sealed hull plating and hidden from every prior scan, opened fire in a pattern precise enough to disable 2 Dominion ships in the space of minutes, forcing the rest of that flank to fall back into disorganized retreat. It wasn't enough to win the battle outright, not against a fleet still nearly twice the size of everything Earth and its lone reawakened cruiser could field, but it was enough to buy time. And time was exactly what Earth's fleet needed to regroup. Tobias Grant worked frantically below decks, rerouting power around damaged systems as fast as they failed, keeping the ship functional through sheer stubbornness more than any technical certainty that it would hold. Every few minutes, another warning flashed across his console, another system threatening to fail entirely, and every few minutes he found some way to keep it running anyway. The turning point came nearly 2 hours into the battle, when Warden identified a weakness in the Dominion formation, a gap left open as Dresk's ships adjusted to counter the cruiser's unexpected resistance. David gave the order without fully understanding the risk involved, trusting Warden's calculations over his own limited experience. "Concentrate remaining power to forward weapons," Warden said. "This maneuver carries significant risk to structural integrity. Recommend proceeding regardless, given current tactical necessity." "Do it," David said again, bracing himself against the console as the ship shuddered under the sudden strain. The resulting strike tore through the heart of the Dominion's central formation, disabling Dresk's flagship long enough to throw the entire fleet into confusion. Without clear orders, without their commander's steady confidence guiding them, Dominion ships began breaking formation entirely, some retreating outright, others hesitating just long enough for Earth's fleet to press whatever advantage remained. Grand Marshal Dresk, watching his own flagship's systems fail around him, finally gave the order he had never expected to give in his long career. "Fall back. Full retreat." Aboard the cruiser, alarms still blared, damage reports still scrolled endlessly across half the panels, and somewhere below decks Tobias Grant was almost certainly still swearing at something that had just stopped working. But above all of it, on the main display, David watched the Dominion fleet begin pulling away from Earth, scattered and disorganized, their confident advance broken by a ship nobody had believed could still fight. Rita let out a slow breath beside him, exhaustion and disbelief mixing in equal measure across her face. "We held," she said quietly, as if she still wasn't entirely sure she believed it. "For now," Warden added. "Threat has withdrawn. Full assessment of long-term consequences remains pending. David allowed himself a moment, just one, to feel the weight lift slightly from his shoulders before the next set of problems inevitably arrived. Earth was still standing. That, for now, was enough. Silence after a battle sounds different from silence before one. David Osei noticed it almost immediately once the last Dominion ship vanished from the cruiser's sensors, a quiet that felt heavier than the noise it replaced, filled with things nobody aboard the ship had time to feel until the fighting actually stopped. Repairs began almost immediately, even before the adrenaline had fully faded. Tobias Grant moved through the ship checking systems one by one, muttering about damage that would take weeks to properly fix, though there was less frustration in his voice now than there had been during the frantic days of preparation before the battle. Whatever the cruiser had been before, it had proven itself capable of far more than anyone expected, and that seemed to matter more to Tobias than the extra work ahead of him. Word of the battle spread fast, far faster than David expected. Within days, reports reached beyond Earth's own system, carried along trade routes and communication relays by traders eager to share news of a Dominion fleet turned away from a supposedly defenseless world. Some versions of the story exaggerated wildly, describing the cruiser as some ancient galactic weapon capable of destroying entire fleets single-handedly. Others stayed closer to the truth, crediting a combination of stubborn defense, unexpected technology, and a fair amount of luck. Captain Rita Alvarez found herself busier than ever in the aftermath, coordinating repairs to Earth's battered defense fleet while fielding a growing number of messages from officials who had shown little interest in Earth's situation only weeks earlier. Fleet Command, once skeptical of her warnings, now moved quickly to expand and strengthen Earth's defenses, unwilling to be caught unprepared a second time. The Galactic Trade Council's response came more slowly and far more cautiously. Elder Sova requested a formal meeting, this time traveling personally to Earth rather than receiving reports from a comfortable distance. She toured the damaged remains of Earth's defense fleet, listened to accounts from officers who had fought in the battle, and eventually made her way to Ring Station 12 to see the cruiser itself. "I did not expect to be proven wrong so completely," Sova admitted, standing beside David near the ship's outer hull, her expression unusually open for someone known throughout the Council for careful neutrality. "You weren't entirely wrong," David said. "We almost lost. If Warden hadn't had those hidden systems, if Rita hadn't gotten Earth's fleet organized in time, if the Dominion had pushed just a little harder, this would be a very different conversation." "Perhaps," Sova said, "but you did not lose. And that changes things. The Council has spent generations treating Earth as a minor, unremarkable world. I suspect that assumption will not survive much longer." She offered no formal alliance, no immediate treaty, but her tone carried something that had been missing from every previous interaction between Earth and the wider galactic community: genuine respect, earned rather than assumed. It was a small step, but David understood, even then, that small steps mattered more than grand declarations when it came to changing minds that had been fixed for a very long time. Grand Marshal Drest's retreat did not go unnoticed within the Vanter Dominion either. Reports of the failed annexation attempt spread through Dominion command channels, drawing sharp criticism from superiors who had expected an easy, quiet victory rather than a humiliating withdrawal. Dresk himself offered no public explanation beyond acknowledging that Earth's defenses had been significantly underestimated, a phrase that did little to soften the damage done to his reputation. Whether the Dominion would attempt another approach toward Earth remained an open question, one nobody aboard the cruiser was foolish enough to assume had been permanently settled. Aboard the ship, life slowly began settling into something resembling routine, though nothing about it felt quite as ordinary as it once had. Warden continued recovering fragments of memory, piecing together more of its own history with each passing week, though large gaps remained. Questions about who had built it and why its origins had been so carefully hidden still unanswered. David found himself, more than once, standing quietly in the command deck long after Tobias and the rest of the crew had gone to rest, thinking about how differently everything had turned out from what he'd expected the day he raised 2 fingers at a junk auction out of little more than boredom and curiosity. "You could have told me what you were, back at the start," David said one evening, watching status lights flicker steadily across newly repaired panels. Would have saved me a lot of confusion. I did not know myself. Not fully, Warden replied. Some answers required time and circumstances to uncover. I suspect more remain. You think this is over? The Dominion, I mean. Unlikely, Warden said, honest as always, even when honesty wasn't especially comforting. Earth has demonstrated capability the Dominion did not anticipate. This is more likely to draw further attention than to end it entirely. David let out a slow breath, somewhere between exhaustion and reluctant acceptance. He thought about selling the ship more than once during those long weeks of preparation, back when the fight ahead had seemed impossible to survive. He didn't think about it anymore. Then I guess we keep going, he said. Yes, Warden agreed. I believe that is precisely what protecting Earth requires. Outside the hull, Ring Station 12 carried on much as it always had, indifferent to the battle fought and one somewhere beyond its usual concerns. But somewhere in that ordinary noise, word continued to spread, quietly reshaping how the wider galaxy viewed a small, previously unremarkable world that had just proven it was far harder to conquer than anyone expected. And aboard a ship once sold as forgotten scrap, a very old order, given long before David Osei was ever born, remained exactly what it had always been, unfinished and very much still active.